On behalf of Moray House Trust, for anyone who's new to us, welcome to another session in the Samaan series. So Richard was kind enough to share a few essays by the late Kamau Brathwaite about nation language. They're now 50 years old. The ideas in the essays are still fresh. Put very simply, and I'm mindful of the very learned audience, Brathwaite posits that the language we use shapes and constrains our worldview and our psyche, what he calls our perceptual models. Some of Brathwaite's assumptions may be open to question. For example, the idea that there is a measure of coherence or underlying common structure to Amerindian languages or indeed to African languages. However, his basic proposals still hold firm. There was, he writes, an underground language constantly transforming itself into new forms. Many of the metaphors in his essays are geographical. He speaks of a submerged experience coming to the surface. It's almost as if Brathwaite is conjuring the tectonic shifts that shaped the physical landscape of our islands to illustrate the contortions in our mental landscape. Dialect is, in Brathwaite's view, a legacy of the plantation. It reflects the constraints of the dominant colonial languages, even as it subverts them. By contrast, nation languages, he posits, are different, or nation language, I should say. That is explicitly grounded in oral tradition. It adopts different syllabic and stress patterns, and it is an expression of community. It depends on an audience. In the first of these sessions, we spent quite a bit of time considering the limitations of a readership for poetry in the Caribbean, given the size of our populations. Reading Brathwaite's essays, one is tempted to look at this from a slightly different angle. Is he suggesting the primacy, for example, of performance over print? Again and again in our Moray House Trust poetry recitals, we have seen Caribbean poems come to life when they are read aloud, when they are shared with an audience. Quite literally, the words leap off the page. Yet, to rekindle another theme from the first session, how much of our collective energy in the Caribbean is spent encouraging and organizing regular live readings? Are we still, and I know this is going to be a little controversial, enthralled to the prestige of print? Richard George is a writer of essays, fiction, and 3 collections of poetry. He's a founding editor of, I hope I pronounced this correctly, MoCo, Caribbean Arts and Letters, a digital publication. He lives and teaches in the Virgin Islands, and in 2020 he was appointed their first poet laureate. He will read and consider poems by Dionne Brand, Kamau Brathwaite, and Lorna Goodison. Over to you, Richard.
Well, just a first minor correction. Maybe if I was from St. Lucia, I would be George, but I'm very boringly anglicized as George is.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah,
Apologies for that, and thank you.
my father says it takes 2 George to make a Georges. So, but as we are here, I think interestingly, what I have selected to read is perhaps Brathwaite's one of his uh, less illustrative excerpts because it's pretty much written in standard. The other thing I would like to say, you know, just because there's a bit of overlap with the project I'm editing right now, a collection of short stories from the Greater Virgin Islands, is as we translate uh, nation languages or creoles to the page, there are a lot of decisions that have to be made editorially, on behalf of the writer as well as the publisher. So, for example, whether the language is transcribed, whether phonetically or syntactically, because syntax can do quite a lot in representation of nation languages, particularly in the creoles that don't depart dramatically from the standard, where the structure and the grammar is the defining characteristic. So I'm thinking, for example, of by and large of, like Trinidadian English or Virgin Islands Creole, et cetera, that are not so far removed. They also can do quite a bit, at least in fiction, designating things like class and socioeconomic background. Um, that does not hold up. Um, for example, with Patois, which has a very complex grammar, yes, but more importantly, a vocabulary that is vastly different from the standard and doesn't easily um, fit. So I think that it's interesting how much the writer has to sort of determine in terms of how they're going to approach language, particularly the language that is spoken, whether in the poem or in prose. And for all purposes today, the three writers I've selected, Stuart would know, also appear in my dissertation. So maybe I'm cheating a little bit. Um, but the sections that I'm concerned with, I believe, can be read in sort of in conversation with each other in various ways. They sort of have a meandering narrative element, very much concerned with setting. And so I was going to start by excerpting the beginning of rites of passage, and maybe we could start our conversations there. But I'm really reading from the beginning of rites of passage, which begins with the stanza or with the line, "It will be a long, long time before we see this land again." Yes. So if you can bear with me, I will read and then we probably can move through the poem and how it departs from much of the rest of the collection and very much the trilogy of the Arrivants in language and tone and in structure. It will be a long, long time before we see this land again, these trees again, drifting inland with the sound of surf, smoke rising. It will be a long, long time before we see these farms again, soft, wet, slow, green again, a buri, a kwamu, mist rising. Watch now these hard men, cold, clear-eyed like the water we ride, skillful with sail and the rope and the tackle. Watch now these hard men, bold as the water banging the bow in a sudden wild tide, indifferent it seems to the battle of wind in the water for our blood, mixed soon with their passion in sport, in indifference, in anger, will create new soils, new souls, new ancestors, will flow like this tide fixed to the star by which this ship floats to new worlds, new waters, new harbors, the pride of our ancestors mixed with the wind and the water, the flesh and the flies, the whips and the fixed fear of pain in this chained and welcoming port. I think where I want to start, because as you scroll down, Isabel, you can see um, a structure of enjambment that is much more reflective of the larger work, the breaking the line in the middle, um, not just of sentences of thoughts, but, interrupting syllable, so it's a very complex and musical collection, very much concerned with the air and how these sounds sort of fit together, how they can be kind of destabilized and deconstructed and rethought of. It reminds me a lot of well, the sort of attention the Rasta pays to word and meaning is very reflective of that sort of practice to me, at least linguistically. But if we go to what this excerpt I read, if you go back up, Isabel, this is a very, I don't want to say traditional, but a very metered and even poem that doesn't abide by those same sorts of formalistic concerns. It utilizes something I'm quite preoccupied with right now, which is the echo and the repetition of thought and image, and it does it as a sort of an imposed structure. Here we have the repetition of the first line with a um, slight tweaks, if you will, but it will be a long, long time. Watch now these hard men, um, and you see that sort of kind of create a sort of structure which the poem is raised. We're looking at these two quatrains that seem very, very rigidly metered, and then we have the remaining um, piece in the tercets. But if we look as well, the sea tree, sea green, and then you see like a lot of alliteration in between as well. Where am I? The repetition of mixed and fixed and so on. You're seeing a lot of internal rhyme that is, um, not a great departure from the rest of the collection, but is striking in terms of the formalistic approach that he takes here, which is, I don't want to say odd, but is not a common um, feature of Brathwaite's work. He will, of course, I think that the quote we all famously remember is, "And the hurricane doesn't roar in pentameter." But this poem seems to be very much concerned with meter and a very traditional formalistic approach. So I think that's one reason why I wanted to read it. That it's a striking departure um, from a lot of Brathwaite's work. And even more so when you get to like the Sycorax style and how things appear on the page. So I think that's the first place I wanted to stop and to see, since we have many writers in the room, perhaps some thoughts on this particular excerpt and the structure that we see here and what might be achieved. I think most of us here would have read Arrivant. And so what is really being um, accomplished by having this departure of form?
Well, just to break the ice, really. I mean, one of the interesting things I think about Brathwaite is that he uses the whole gamut of language that's available to him as a highly educated intellectual, West Indian intellectual. So it runs from, very formal British English almost, inflected by a sort of Bajan lilt, to, as you say, in the Sycorax poems which are absolutely inaccessible to someone who's entirely rooted in standard English and isn't able to make the kind of cultural connections that are there bedded in the language. And that seems to me to be true to him and his generation, that he had all those voices. He had access to that range of language, and that to deny that would be in a way to, cut the knees from under him, because he needs them. He addresses different people in different modes of language.
Different registers. Yeah.
Mm.
Mhm.
I'm very struck by how the sounds embody the emotion of the poem. Um, it's very wistful. I won't say nostalgic, but it carries the vision and also the pain. And I think that's one of the most important things that sound does in a poem. I'm a very visual poet, but I always edit by sound. It's the way into the truth of the poem. And I think this is just such a brilliant example of that. With the wind and the water, the flesh and the flies, the whips and the fixed fear of pain in this chained and welcoming port. Brilliance. Okay, that's it. Hand down.
Thanks, Nancy. There is particularly for me in the first two stanzas, not just the register of the language, but the rigidity of the meter is interesting to me, because I think the majority of the work, regardless of the linguistic dimension, tends to be free. But it will be a long, long time before we see this land again, these trees. It will be a long, long time before we see these farms again, soft, wet, slow green again. I don't know, of course, the poet's intention as to whether perhaps the voice of this time is less accessible, and therefore the standard sort of kind of fills in that gap. But I just thought this would be an interesting piece to start off with, and particularly to read.
Richard, can I just add there, when he wrote that poem, he was still Edward Brathwaite.
Oh, see?
As he moves forward, it becomes Edward Kamau, and then he becomes Kamau and won't answer to Edward. And that seems to be indicated in the, in the journey of the language as well.
Well, that's a benefit of having your personal knowledge.
It's just the benefit of being old.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that note. That makes a whole lot of sense.
Okay, just a final point on Kamau. I was writing something on Kamau, which sort of got aborted for various reasons. But just two quick points I want to make. And as it was supposed to be an essay on the Arrivans. And I read it and so on and so forth, and I got stalled for whatever reason. But the point of my quote-unquote thesis and what I was going to do for the essay, I found certainly the Arrivans a major accomplishment of creative imagination, a unique contribution to Caribbean and African diaspora literature that will remain unrivaled. And the more I read Brathwaite, especially what followed later, and I'll say something about the later work just very briefly in a moment. Arrivance is vast in conception. We see Richard is showing us almost the early beginnings of the Arrivance and Brathwaite's work, where he does this, then he begins to move more and more, if you want, radically into the breaking up of lines and letters and what he's doing, and whole masks and other things he's doing, and sun poem and so forth. It is vast in conception over his trilogy, radical in poetics, uncompromising in anchoring itself in the African roots of the majority of Caribbean people. It is not only a necessary creative acknowledgement of the colonized, despised past, but a contemporary traveling through its carefully wrought sections with a harborless spade to this Calibans and so on. But the second part to my comment, this is about the third time I'm reading this book. This is Gordon Rolai's last book. And Gordon Rolai, I think all of us who knew Gordon and Gordon's work, there are many great Caribbean critics and writers. Gordon remains to me the foremost in many ways. But this book, put out by People Tree, Gordon's last book, which is being produced, and he suddenly died. A literary friendship, selected notes on the Kamau Brathwaite Gordon Rolai correspondence. And I raise this in terms of Richard is looking, if you want, at almost the beginnings of Brathwaite's radical work through the Arrivance and so on. And these letters with Gordon show some of Kamau's work and so on in those early years. But also goes on to look at the very radical work he went on to do, including all the typographical things many of you would know, his Sycorax style and all these sort of things. So he moved on from what we're discussing into a kind of radical poetics, which I think remains unrivaled, and it'll take many years of close study of what Kamau did. But I really recommend this to you all. It's a very moving book. Gordon writes those of you who knew Gordon Rollet, directly, honestly, doesn't cover anything. That friendship he had for many years with Kamau, but it also shows Kamau almost in his declining years. Kamau was never, I mean, there's certain people who wrote, like Patterson from St. Lucia, who wrote a famous essay, Walker versus Brathwaite, and Kamau never forgave her. So Kamau had all these sensitivities towards how people saw his work. But this book really brings out through the letters. And after Doris died, his wife, how the work became more and more complex, in a sense, difficult. But as he struggled for this, to keep clarifying those early visions of his vision of a Caribbean aesthetic and Caribbean culture, and a kind of what are the French Césaire and Senghor, these guys. What was the famous term? Anybody help me out there? And Kamau was going for something like that, the negritude kind of idea, Creole Caribbean. And as he goes on to his work, he's trying more to clarify that, but becoming more and more disappointed. Anyway, just to wrap this up, coming out of what Richard just introduced here, Kamau's early beginnings, as it were, this book will show you where he went from that into the final years and so on. A very sad book in many ways, very powerful book, very moving book, but certainly brings us into even the other work, like Born to Slow Horses and so on, which he did later. Just thought I would, for those who perhaps not fully aware of this, Gordon's last book. And of course, Gordon was a major critic and writer on Kamau from Pathfinders and a whole lot of other things. Just my 2 cents on this. But thanks, Richard, for warming us up on that.
No, not at all. My pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
A critique, I guess, that could be levied against, I guess, many writers is a sort of the despite the whatever the intentions may have been at the time, sort of some of the erasures that are present, and one of the biggest glaring voids is the voices and experiences of women, especially in the early tomes, or I guess you would say, of Caribbean literature. And I guess if you're looking at the emergence of a long list of Caribbean women voices into the literary canon, I think Goodison is, alongside Senior and others, clearly have a whole lot to say about that. And of course, as I'm watching these luminaries enter the Zoom, getting more and more intimidated. I see Donald Pollard just joined. But anyhow, so I wanted to read my mother's sea shanty. I wanted to read Turn Thanks for Grandmother Hannah in terms of, not just in terms of the language and of the excellent structure and formalistic approaches that Goodison has, but also in terms of how she is sort of politicizing, ASP, and historicizing these other experiences and narratives that can be easily discounted or dismissed as being mundane or unimportant. How through the poetry she is sort of lionizing and elegizing these figures in her life. So, and you can read that in contrast to the first selection, where Brathwaite talks about, watch now these hard men, and sort of does play the tropes of history being a thing that is sort of concerned with a sort of performance of masculinity. So that's something I wanted to read in contrast. But if we start with, I'll read my mother's sea shanty, and then I'll go straight into Turn Thanks for Grandmother Hannah. I am washing my mother's body in the night sea, and as she sings slow, and as she still breathes, I see my sweet mother, a plump mermaid in my dreams, and I wash her white hair with ambergris and foaming seaweed. I watch my mother underwater gather the loose pearls she finds, scrub them free from nacre, and string them on a lost fishing line. I hear my dark mother speaking sea speak with pilot fish, showing them how to direct barks that bear away our grief and anguish. I pray my mother breaks free from the fish spots and marine shores of her residence beneath the sea, and that she rides a wild white horse. Turn thanks to grandmother Hannah. My grandmother Hannah aspired to sanctity through the domestic vocation of laundering the used, soiled vestments of the clergy into immaculate and unearthly brightness. She would wash, starch, and smooth them like the last few feet of the road to heaven with a heavy self-heater iron, its belly blazing with the harnessed energy of the coals of hell. Every clergyman in St. Elizabeth's parish would seek out her cleansing service, reclaiming that which seemed marked for perdition was Hannah's holy gift. Wine-stained altar cloths, once chaste white albs would rejoice, spotless, transfigured to stand, redeemed under the resurrecting power of grandmother Hannah's hands. To be perfect in whatsoever you are called to do is counted in heaven as sincere prayer. My father's mother prayed through laundering the garments used in temple service. To my grandmother with the cleansing power in her hands, my intention here is to give thanks on behalf of any who have experienced within something like the redemption in her washing. Yeah, so I think this is an incredible collection, and I just wanted to read these two, and these are just from the early section of the book. Isabella, I hope you're smiling because of the poems, but I just read them as sort of particularly in those first those two poems I read, I think are illustrative of the point I was trying to make, that there is an unspoken power that Goodison is trying to access and amplify in the bodies of these women in her family, which to me greatly influences my own work because I definitely believe in the power of the internal life, the power of the, I guess the mundanity to kind of bring meaning to the larger uh, um, questions that we are grappling with. And I think sometimes, you know, if the poem itself is concerned with things that are too grand and too large, it becomes then a impersonal barrier between the reader and the work. It appears um, um, it seems to miss a sincerity or earnestness or life that I think Goodison is adept at capturing. And so that's why I want to open up again the conversation to that sort of idea that these poems are not what I would term confessional, so to speak, but she also is not afraid of, I don't want to use the word the magical, but a different uh, spiritual, I'll use the word register that I think is less, that contains less presumptions than some of the other work that is attempting um, similar goals. I want to say as well, in terms of Goodison is definitely a strong formalist. You see the structures of these poems and the meter and the rhyme as well.
So while we're waiting for someone to pluck up courage, I'm struck. This is an anthropological kind of observation rather than a critical one. I'm struck by the almost ritual element of washing and of laundry.
Washing the body.
Washing the body and washing the clothes in
Yes.
so much of our literature. And that's why I was smiling when you read the second poem. because I think the number of descriptions I've read over the years in all sorts of weird and wonderful, places of the role of, like washing day and the washerwoman, and those are they're very powerful rituals and very powerful roles in traditional Caribbean society, which of course now have gone. So there's a slightly almost you feel she's preserving elements of a ritual that has disappeared.
And of course, both of the washings are to sanctify,
I would
to
like to say
prepare.
something. I would like to say something about that beautiful couple of words, speaking, sea speak, because I think as writers from the island, we are so influenced by the sea, and its rhythms and its presence and its symbolism of the subconscious. So I just want to notice that, and also say that in the last couple of decades, women writers have really brought the domestic scene fiercely forward, really opened it up, and nobody quite like this poet. Thank you so much for these poems, Richard.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I wasn't able to join at the start. I just wondered whether you've got anything more that you could say to us about that phrase, turn thanks. It seems, obviously, it's the title of the collection, but I was just interested in that sense of the kind of this idea of sort of female labor and the importance of kind of recognizing the energy and the agency that's part of that. And that phrase, turn thanks, seems to be so important in reminding us that to kind of express gratitude or to say something as mundane as thank you isn't kind of passive, that there's something really importantly kind of it makes you an agent to be involved in that kind of that statement of thanks. Yeah. And I just wondered if there was anything more you could tell us about that phrase and how it means something within this poem, but also kind of across the collection.
I mean, in terms of it's definitely the process or its own ritual of gratitude links the entire collection. In terms of the phrases import, it's not in my cultural vernacular. So I don't know if there are any Jamaicans who know if turn thanks is itself a phrase in use, but it definitely, in terms of the collection, is the sort of linking conceit throughout the work. So it's about moving through these relationships and these spaces, and it's definitely some sort of elegy, but also quite a gratitude giving exercise to individuals, to landscape, to place, etc. So I'm opening the floor if there is anyone. I've never heard anyone say turn thanks in casual talk.
I was very fortunate in the 70s. I was at Cave Hill, and I was fortunate to be able to hear Kamau when he would come to visit Barbados. He'd be reading when Arrivals first came out on those books. I mean, tremendous audiences. The place was full. He read so absolutely wonderfully. Those of us who were fortunate to hear him read, he was a great reader of his own work, And in many ways, it probably influenced a whole generation of poets, in terms of form and so on, but in terms of reading. I think on YouTube, you can find some of his readings, Born to Slow Horses and so on. There's a poem talking about the death of his wife's son on the first night and so on the second night. Powerful, powerful reader of his own work, which brings into Caribbean poetry a whole matter of the voice, which he was very much into again, how we read our Caribbean, the nation language. Really, that's what we're heading towards. All these ideas of nation language, our languages as Caribbean people, apart from the formal English, fine, formal French, but we have our own nation language.
Yes, I think he read Arrivants at Carafesta, the first Carafesta in Guyana.
I was at the first Carafesta, yes.
And it had an absolutely seismic effect on at least the Guyanese section of the audience, because certainly my father went home and ordered the book, as did several of his contemporaries. So I remember always seeing it on the bookshelves growing up. And it was hearing him read it.
Right,
that
exactly. Yeah.
had that effect. Yeah.
Yeah, he really brought something unique into that, you know? And as we say that now, Richard, I'm thinking, you look at Lorna Goodison, I mean, some of us have heard Lorna read and so on. In some ways, I don't know, I have Lorna's collection. I actually have her collected poems here right by me. I guess all poets, Caribbean poets are, I mean, quote unquote local in the sense that we write about what we know, where we are, where we are born. I often find Jamaican poets very, very Jamaican. Not saying Trinidadian poets are not, or St. Lucian poets or Bajan poets are not. And so I find Lorna's work, Richard, very Jamaican. As you mentioned, domestic, the ordinary lives that she writes about in how many, 500 or 600 pages, and all her books are in these collected poems. And then I wonder, sometimes of course, as a reader or people reading it, yes, you can get into it in a general way. This is life and so on, as a woman growing up as a child or whatever, with your grandmother, whatever. But she names Jamaica, names place in Jamaica. Now, only sometimes that's not a challenge. Having said that, I almost, retreat immediately from what I just said, because we all write about our home places. But in a sense, I think I'm trying to say I find Lorna a very challenging poet and writer for many of those reasons, and very distinctive from a Kamau, of course, who is doing other things with his poetics. I mean, just some passing thoughts, very general thoughts, no firm.
I just wanted to respond to what you were saying about Lorna writing about Jamaica. I found, as a Bermudian poet, that there was just something so thrilling about naming things in my environment and in my society that really had not been named before. And because I live in America, there was some envy from writers that I know here that this kind of writing that is, post-colonial literature had a virginal period where we as poets were bringing into text things that had not been named before. Something as simple as cassava pie, writing about that and validating it and exploring the symbols of it and the history of it. Very exciting. So thank you for bringing up that point.
I was going to say that's like probably one of my preoccupations is writing the various Virgin Islands into Caribbean literature. I think that's sort of what, that's kind of what I read by these poems of domestic life, in terms of the grand political and historical concerns, are sort of impersonal. And it's sort of like by looking at, like the point I was making before I read the poem, by looking at what is considered the mundane, is how these lives are given dimension. And that is not just, the Afro-Caribbean or Indo-Caribbean experience, but no, these are people, individualized experiences that to me make a place, a space, a culture more relatable, more empathetic, more real. And so that's sort of my whole thing is about in the work that I do. I think almost literally everything I've written while there's some Trinidad in there because it's my childhood experience, almost everything I write is so centered and set in the Virgin Islands for that very reason, because it's an underwritten space. And you know, you by writing in the Virgin Islands and from the Virgin Islands, I get to be sort of pioneering in that regard. You know, I sort of be able to kind of like going back to Walcott and the Adamic qualities of Caribbean literature that he identifies in what the Twilight says.
Yes.
You know, these
Agreed,
spaces,
yeah.
these stories, I sort of get to start the conversation on many of them. These lesser known histories, these lesser known experiences.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the longer you write, in fact, the more we dig into where we're from, you know, the longer Richard writes, the more he writes about Virgin Islands, the longer I write, the more I'm writing more about St. Lucia. And in a sense, Lorna shows us how to do that. You see? Even though we may say, but are people understanding? But they will get it. Those who read closely will get it, because the poet is also passing on, in a sense, through her drawing and imaging of what she knows. Something, and as I use the word universal, is being passed on. People in England or Africa, wherever it might be.
Yeah, I think I just want to enter the discussion here and saying that what Lorna Goodison and other poets, what we're all doing is in a very real sense is modeling what we had. We grew up with European literature with references, the daffodils. I didn't know what the hell a daffodil was. Many of us did not, right? Because they also wrote from their specificity and made it universal. And what people like Lorna Goodison and others are doing is making our space, our stories universal, and filling in the gaps that the colonialism carefully and orchestratedly omitted. And so that's the value of, I don't understand this whole tool. Well, I understand it intellectually, but post-coloniality, I think, is a crap term that I don't ever want to get into. But I think what is at heart here, what people of Lorna's generation have been doing and continue to do, and George's and other people now continue that, is we are writing our stories unapologetically. And we are, in a sense, excavating the orality that our parents and grandparents didn't have a chance to do. And that's a very revolutionary aspect of revolutionary and dynamic aspect of Caribbean, is that we are defining what the Caribbean is, as opposed to having the external define it for us. So it's not just our beaches and our suns, it's the ordinary, extraordinary lives that are lived each day, that we participate in, that we see, that we celebrate.
Great, yes.
Yeah,
I like that.
yeah. I think the other thing I would say is, in terms of myself and my contemporaries, I would have encountered Wordsworth after Walcott. So so I have that dimension is there as well. The people who are writing now out of the space very much likely read, Ruins of a Great House or Far Cry from Africa or something. Or they would have read Olive Senior's short stories, or M. Nobis Phillips' work, etc., prior to being, quote unquote, colonized by English literature. So I think that is one other aspect that might, not necessarily complicate, but, nuance some of the work that comes out now. That it is not a situation whereby the contemporary poets, are seeing a need, so to speak, to break free from something, because they already have normalized the Caribbean voices as being the centric to the work
Their voices,
they're doing.
Right, yeah, correct, yeah, agreed.
And it's almost as if the voice goes from, we started with Brathwaite, it is historical voice that has a certain distance, despite its the emotion in the work. There's a certain distance from the page, I guess you could say. And that there's no individualization taking place. And we move to Goodison, where we're looking at these maternal figures within the family history. And then now we're moving to Brand, where it's like very personalized and introspective, and reflective, which I thought was an interesting transition. But at the same time, the introspective voice is very much concerned with space, and a very particular space in Northern Trinidad. So Hard Against the Soul. And this is the opening section of No Language is Neutral, which is in itself a response and a subversion, if you will, of a Walcott line. This is you, girl. This cut of road up to Blanchisseuse. This every turn a piece of blue and earth carrying on, beating, rock and ocean, this wearing away, smoothing the insides full of shell and coral. This is you, girl. This is you, all sides of me. Hill road and dip through the coconut at Manzanilla. This sea breeze shaped forest of sand and lanky palm. This wanting to fall, hanging, greening, quenching the road. This is you, girl, even though you never see it, the drop before timberline, that daub of black shine, sea on bush smoke land, that pulse of the heart that stretches up to Maracas, Lafayette Bay. Never know you, but you make it wash up from the rocks. This is you, girl, that bit of lagoon, alligator long abandoned, this stone of my youngness, hesitating to walk right, turning to Shona's road, turning to Duen and Spirit, to the sea wall and sea breaking hard against things, turning to burning reason. This is you, girl. This is the poem no woman ever write for a woman, because she's afraid to touch this river, boiling like a woman in she sleep. That smell of fresh thighs and warm sweat, sheets of her like the nighton rolling into the Atlantic. This is you, girl, something never waning or forgetting, something hard against the soul. This is where you make sense, that the sight becomes tender, the night air human, the dull silence full, chattering. Will volcanoes cease, and to be awake is more lovely than dreams. And I think the voice and the rhythm of this poem is so enthralling. And again, I think because of my current preoccupation in my own writing of the echo, is why I've kind of picked these three poets and these three selections, because they all have that echoing line, phrase, image that I am so enthralled by right now. So where do we start? What I find interesting is the marrying of the land and marine images, the focus, of course, as Stuart will be aware, one of my preoccupations is the sea, and how it can be, transformed in terms of how each poet chooses to implement a sort of poetics informed by the sea. And so here, the sea is both in terms of geographical element, but it's also linguistic in terms of the echo, the repeating shoreline, the waves coming back in. This is you, girl. This is you, girl. This is you, girl. There's also a sort of sensual metaphor. It takes on quite a bit of sexual connotation as well. Yeah, not just in this poem, but also in the larger collection. The sea is many things here, also in terms of, it's both a destructive and creative force. You're talking about the smoothing the insides, the wearing away of the sea, on the coast rather, the beating of the rock by the ocean, this carrying on between land and water, between solid and liquid, something that is permeates this collection. Again, if you're not familiar with this, I'm not sure how easy it is to get these days, but definitely try and get a collection, a copy of this work by Brand.
I just love the identity with the land and with nature. the full immersion of the psyche into that. As a woman, it's just so compelling to read. Well done.
I myself love Dionne Brand's work. I mean, if I had to top 5 of poets, yeah, there are many great poets around, but Dionne, Kwame Dawes, Lorna Goodison, these people are top for me. What Richard is saying, the voice you hear when you hear a Dionne or you read a Dionne, it's like a Lorna too. It's certainly Kamau, very obviously. There's a voice in Dionne. There's a voice coming through. And just by the way, if people want No Language is Neutral, her collected poems, Nomenclature, which came out a year or two ago, has a lot of those books in there. But there's a voice Dionne I like, and the images how she pulls things together, drawing all those images, whether it's city, Toronto, whether Trinidad. But, I really like the sound of her voice and how she digs deep into so many things. I know I'm sounding very vague trying to explain it, but she's a top major poet for me. I say Kwame, Lorna, and people like this, So those are good choices, Richard. 3 major poets, definitely. Kamau, without a doubt. Lorna, absolutely. And Dionne, top of the line,
I like the point I was making at the beginning, like so much can be done with syntax.
Yes,
to
correct.
to distinguish and delineate, Caribbean voice, and Caribbean experience.
Yeah.
So, and so it on the page may look like standard, but as you read, you pick up the voice and the
Precisely.
distinction,
Correct,
of that experience.
Yeah.
How much of
Register.
that is us being able to project from our sort of memory banks a Trinidadian accent onto this poem? Because I just wonder if read, with another accent, if it has the same cadence, if it has the same rhythm.
It won't.
No.
It won't.
Yeah.
Which is why I think a mark of good literature, that it has that in many ways we are sort of an inside audience for our poets and our novelists and our prose writers. I think also that not every language, well, she says no language is neutral, but not every language has the same entry points. Yes. So I know, for example, there are elements of Guyanese language that are attributable to me, similar Jamaican and so on, because the ambit of my linguistic experience does not include, or for example, a rural Antiguan Creole is also difficult for me, just because it's outside of my experience. So I think it's easy for people outside of the Caribbean to assume that because we're all quote unquote the Anglophone Caribbean, that every language used is going to be accessible in the same ways, which I think is a dangerous misnomer.
Correct, yeah.
It's a assumption that homogenizes and creates a sort of monolith that just does not exist. We are all of these micro groups that have some overlaps, and shared experiences and shared cultures and histories, but some overlaps. So for example, culturally in Virgin Islands, you're going to see a lot more of the Dominican and Puerto Rico than you might expect elsewhere in the region.
Right.
And that can't be equated to, let's say, Venezuelan influences in Trinidad. Because again, it's not the same, even though it's a similar linguistic quote unquote interference, it's a very different cultural interaction. I think similarly, the Virgin Islands is a very peculiar place because you recall that the US Virgin Islands only became American about 100 years ago. And for their colonial experiences is with Denmark. So it does all kind of weird things in terms of language,
Right.
but also in terms of we have these cultural markers, but even in terms of cuisine, some weird stuff happens in the Virgin Islands and Anguilla and St. Martin because of that Danish presence. There's way more milk and sugar in the food than you would expect. And some of the techniques that are seen as very much Virgin Islander techniques and dishes are because of those interruptions that you don't see in the Southern Caribbean or the Western Caribbean, for example. So we have to be very wary about being. I mean, it's all well and good to have Caribbean literature, but it's very dangerous to assume that, you just have to separate or I mean, not separate, but disaggregate by which colonial power was dominating. Because I think also we often and it's something that we try to do in MoCo is to work against our separations from the Hispanophone, Francophone, Caribbeans, the Dutch islands, and so on and so forth. Because, like I said, the Virgin Islands and a lot of the Les Antilles have, rich historical connections with Puerto Rico and the Dominican in particular. I think you hear more about Cuba, but, really and truly, every Virgin Islander has Dominican family, so, we have to platform as much as we can these underwritten and underspoken aspects of the Caribbean experience, to my mind.
It has to do also with structure.
Yeah.
I know I'm obsessed with what I call breaking apart linear intentional thinking, or Wolf referred to as the male sentence. And I kind of find the use of image metaphor is a way of making a poem where one thing is reflected in another. And to me, this is a very feminine way of writing. So I'm just saying the structure itself is not ever neutral. It's intended. So as we go from island to island with all the histories behind the different influences of different countries, yes, it's always going to be rendered different meanings. Really good point.